All right, so we're diving into a case that the media kind of sensationalized, calling it The Preacher and the Porn Star. It happened back in 2009. The story involves Brian Randon, well, you guessed it, a preacher, and Felicia Tang, who was a model and an actress. And their paths kind of collided in this whirlwind romance that ended tragically with Felicia's death.
Yeah, and this case, it's not just about like these two worlds clashing, the religious world and Hollywood. I mean, it really is a deep dive into this like legal battle,
Yeah.
conflicting evidence, and ultimately this controversial verdict that left, well, a lot of people wondering if justice was actually served.
Looking at all the stuff you gave me, the court transcripts, these interviews, we even have insights from the jurors. Where do we even start with something like this?
Well, I think it's important to start with Felicia's story. I mean, she came all the way from Singapore to Los Angeles, right? With these dreams of making it big in Hollywood.
Yeah, and she actually had roles in some pretty well-known films. Rush Hour 2, The Fast and the Furious.
Exactly. And she was really making a name for herself. But by 2009, she was kind of at the crossroads. She was enrolled in school, looking for a more stable life, it seemed.
So that's when Brian enters the picture, right?
Right.
What can you tell us about their relationship? It seemed to move pretty fast.
It was definitely a whirlwind. They met in Vegas, and within like 2 months, they were living together. Brian even started introducing Felicia to his family, talking about marriage.
Wow. Marriage? That's a pretty serious commitment after only 2 months. But I know from the sources that not everyone was thrilled about this relationship. Felicia's friend, Christina, was pretty skeptical of Brian's intentions right from the start.
Oh, yeah, Christina was definitely suspicious. I mean, you think about their backgrounds. Brian, this, devout preacher, and Felicia with her past, including some struggles with drugs and her work in adult entertainment. Christina she had a hard time believing that Brian truly accepted all of that.
Yeah, the sources mentioned that Christina actually questioned whether Brian was trying to change Felicia, make her fit into his world. Like she worried that Felicia was getting swept up in this romance without really thinking about, the long-term compatibility. It's interesting how those concerns kind of foreshadow what happens later.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer to the story, for sure.
So let's talk about that night, September 10th, 2009. The sources paint a really chaotic scene.
It all starts with these angry texts from Felicia to Brian. He was late getting home, and Felicia she was furious. And then, according to Brian, when he finally gets to the apartment, Felicia's already acting really agitated. Later that night, Brian claims they both took GHB.
Now, GHB, for our listeners who might not be familiar, is a powerful drug, often used recreationally for its effects, like euphoria and sedation. But it can also be incredibly dangerous, especially in high doses.
Absolutely. It's really unpredictable.
And that's where Brian's story gets, well, a little hard to follow. He initially told the police that they'd had rough sex, but later he completely denies that. Instead, he claims that Felicia's erratic behavior was all because of the GHB. He describes her thrashing around, falling through the closet doors, and injuring herself in the process.
Yeah, so his story changes. And it's important to note that this inconsistency right off the bat, it really made investigators suspicious. It made them question whether he was trying to hide something.
So what about the physical evidence? What did the scene tell the investigators?
The police described the scene as chaotic. The bedroom was a mess, bloodstains, clumps of Felicia's hair. And then there were Felicia's injuries. Over 320 bruises, lacerations, and abrasions.
320, that's just an astounding number.
Yeah, the sheer number and severity of her injuries, it was really shocking.
And Detective Schoonmaker, who was leading the investigation, he was convinced that those injuries, they weren't accidental. He believed they were defensive wounds. And he specifically pointed to the patterns of bruising as evidence of maybe being whipped with something like, a wire hanger.
Right, right. So the detective's interpretation, it painted a pretty clear picture of a violent struggle. But the defense, they had a different explanation, a different narrative altogether. They argued that Felicia's injuries were self-inflicted because of the GHB.
So they were basically saying that the drug was so powerful it could cause someone to injure themselves to that extent.
Yeah, that was their argument. And to support it, they called in an expert witness, Trey Parada, a retired narcotics officer. Parada showed the jury these videos of people on GHB exhibiting these really erratic behaviors, some even hurting themselves. It was pretty disturbing stuff.
So the defense's strategy was to highlight how unpredictable GHB is, how it could lead to these, seemingly bizarre injuries, even without any intention from Brian to harm Felicia.
Exactly. They were trying to portray it as a tragic accident fueled by a dangerous drug. Parada even suggested that Felicia might have taken 2 doses of GHB, one the night before. Maybe that contributed to her anger and her behavior, and then another dose in the morning while Brian was downstairs working.
2 doses, that seems incredibly risky.
Oh, absolutely. And they were arguing that this second dose could explain the severity of her injuries, even though Brian had tried to calm her down.
But the prosecution, they weren't buying it, right?
No, not at all. They argued that there was just no way the extent of Felicia's injuries could be explained by a GHB overdose alone. They were adamant that no matter how potent the drug, she couldn't have inflicted that much damage on herself.
So the jury was faced with these two very different versions of what happened that night.
Exactly. And they had to sort through all of it, the conflicting accounts, the physical evidence, the expert testimony, and decide whether the prosecution had actually proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt, which is, a really high bar to clear in our legal system.
So the jury was really wrestling with these two stories, right? Like, on one hand, you have the prosecution saying, look, these injuries are just too brutal to be self-inflicted. But then you have the defense saying, no, it's the GHB. That's what caused this. It's like a classic he said, she said. But then you throw in this powerful drug that can, really mess with someone's head and their behavior.
Yeah, and it's at this point that the defense introduces this kind of bombshell piece of evidence, and it really throws a wrench into the prosecution's whole case. It's this medical phenomenon, and they call it pulseless electrical activity, or PEA.
PEA. Okay, I'm going to need you to break that down for me. What exactly is PEA, and how does it become, so central to Brian's defense?
So picture this. Paramedics, they arrive at Brian's apartment, right? And Felicia, she's unresponsive. She's not breathing. But here's the thing. Her EKG, it's showing this, faint electrical signal in her heart. And that's PEA. Basically, her heart, it had electrical activity, but it wasn't actually pumping blood effectively.
So, wait, so she had a heartbeat, but she wasn't actually alive?
Yeah, I mean, that's putting it very simply, but essentially, yeah.
Wow. Okay. So how does this help Brian?
Well, the defense, they brought in this former deputy medical examiner, Dr. Harry Bennell, as an expert witness. And Dr. Bennell, he testifies that PEA, it's usually caused by a drug overdose or a significant loss of blood.
Mm-hmm.
But, and this is the crucial part, he says that it's not compatible with smothering.
Hold on. So if what this doctor is saying is true, then Felicia couldn't have died from smothering, which was the prosecution's whole case, right?
Exactly. And this really threw the prosecution off. They tried to call in their own witness, to rebut Dr. Bennell's testimony. But the judge, he said no. So the jury, they're left with this pretty powerful medical evidence that, it cast doubt on the prosecution's whole theory of the case.
Man, the jury had to be reeling. I mean, how do you reconcile these horrific injuries with medical evidence that says, smothering wasn't the cause of death? Did any of the jurors ever talk about, how they dealt with that?
We actually do have insights from a couple of the jurors. They spoke anonymously after the trial. One juror, she was a nurse, and she said that, initially she was really shocked by the extent of Felicia's injuries, but after going over all the evidence, thinking about what Dr. Bennell said, she started to question whether the injuries were really from a violent attack.
A nurse. So someone with a medical background looking at it all with, maybe a different perspective. What about the other juror? What did they say?
Well, the other juror, they believe that Felicia's drug use, it played a big part in her death. And that made them more open to the idea that, maybe it was an accidental overdose. But both of them, they said that Dr. Bennell's testimony, the whole PEA thing, it was a major factor in their decision to acquit Brian.
It's amazing how just one piece of expert testimony can be so influential. But even with all this medical evidence, the photos of Felicia's injuries, they must have been hard to just ignore. Did the jurors say anything about, if they had any doubts?
Yeah, and it's interesting. One of the jurors admitted that even though she voted not guilty, she still thought that Brian was somehow involved in Felicia's death. And it really highlights this important distinction in our legal system, the difference between legal guilt and moral guilt. Just because a jury acquits someone, it doesn't necessarily mean that they think the person is innocent. It just means that based on what was presented, they couldn't say for sure, beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right. So in this case, maybe some of those jurors had their own thoughts about Brian's involvement, but based on what was presented at trial, they couldn't convict him.
Yeah, because that's the thing about our justice system, right? That reasonable doubt standard, it's a pretty high bar.
Yeah.
Even if some jurors had those, lingering doubts, the prosecution just didn't prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt.
So what about the reactions to the verdict? It had to be mixed, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you could see it on their faces. The prosecution, they were stunned. The defense, they were obviously relieved. But Felicia's friend, Christina, she'd always been wary of Brian, and she was furious. She felt like justice hadn't been done, like Brian had gotten away with it.
Well, I can only imagine what Christina was going through. She had warned Felicia about Brian, and now it's like she's left with this awful thought that maybe her friend's death could have been prevented. Did the trial give Christina any sense of closure, or did it just make things worse?
For Christina, the trial just brought more pain, more heartache.
Mhm.
She really felt like the defense's portrayal of Felicia, this idea of her being a drug addict, a party girl, it was just so wrong. Christina, she saw Felicia as this bright, ambitious woman who was trying to get her life back on track. And she felt like the trial just tarnished Felicia's memory and let Brian off the hook.
So we have a not guilty verdict, a stunned prosecution, a grieving friend who feels like the justice system failed her, and Brian, who maintains his innocence. What happened next? Did he just, disappear from public life after all of that?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Just 6 months after he was acquitted, Brian, he gets invited back to preach at the LA Sheriff's Department.
Wait, hold on. Back up. He was invited to preach where?
At the LA Sheriff's Department, the same organization that investigated him for murder.
That's wild. Why on earth would they invite him back after everything that happened?
Yeah, it's definitely a surprising turn of events. I mean, some people might see it as like a symbol of forgiveness, second chances. Maybe the sheriff's department, maybe they believed he was innocent, based on the trial. Or maybe they thought that his message, his preaching about redemption and faith, maybe they thought that could resonate with their officers.
It definitely raises questions about, how we view and how we deal with people who've been accused of these serious crimes, even when they're found not guilty. Did Brian ever talk about the accusations against him directly? Did he, show any remorse for Felicia's death, even acknowledge what her loved ones were going through?
Brian, he went back to preaching, and he stuck to his story. He was innocent. It was all just a big misunderstanding. He even went so far as to say that Detective Schoonmaker, he was obsessed with pinning a murder charge on him, that he ignored evidence that pointed to an accidental overdose.
Well, it's hard to say without, being in those investigator shoes and seeing everything they saw, but it definitely makes you think about, about bias. Even if it's unconscious bias, it can affect how evidence is interpreted and how it's presented. So here we have Brian, the preacher. He's back in the pulpit saying he's innocent. And then we have Christina, still grieving for her friend, convinced that justice was never served. It doesn't seem like there's any real resolution here, no satisfying answer to what actually happened to Felicia Tang.
And that's the unsettling feeling this case leaves you with. It forces us to look at how complex our legal system is, the limits of evidence, and the fact that doubt, it can linger. We have a verdict, but the truth, it still feels out of reach. And we're left wondering, maybe some questions, they just don't have answers.
This whole deep dive has been, a roller coaster. So many emotions, conflicting information. We looked at the evidence, the legal arguments, what the experts said, and how this whole thing affected everyone involved. But like you said, there's no easy answer, no tidy ending. It really is. And I think what makes this case even more complicated is, the whole GHB thing. The defense made a really strong argument that because of this drug and how unpredictable it is, it could cause someone to accidentally hurt themselves, even to this extent. So it makes you think, what does this case say about GHB, and what does it mean for similar cases where this drug is involved?
Yeah, that's a big question, right? I mean, this case, it definitely highlights how dangerous GHB can be and how it can completely cloud someone's judgment to the point where they might do things, hurt themselves even, that they never would if they were sober. And then it becomes this really tricky issue of figuring out, well, who's to blame? When someone's intoxicated, how do we know if it was the drug or if it was intentional?
Yeah, I mean, there are no easy answers there. And it's a question that goes way beyond this one case. It brings up ethical questions, legal dilemmas. And these are things we as a society are going to have to figure out, especially as these drugs, GHB and others, they're still out there.
Absolutely. And I think it also shows just how important it is to have really thorough investigations, to look at all the evidence carefully, and to bring in experts who can, explain the science behind these drugs and what they can do.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I gotta say, I'm still left with this feeling of, I don't know, unease, maybe? We have the verdict, Brian's back to preaching, but there's still this cloud of doubt hanging over everything. Did GHB really cause Felicia's death? Or was there something else, something darker that we just didn't uncover? It's a question I think we all have to wrestle with, especially after going through all the evidence and hearing all the different sides of the story.
And I think that's the whole point of these deep dives, right?
Yeah.
We go beyond the headlines, we look at the details, the different viewpoints, and all the things that make a case complicated. And then we give you, the listener, all that information. We lay it all out there. But ultimately, it's up to you to decide what you believe.
Right. It's not about us telling you what to think. It's about giving you the tools to think for yourself. So go back to the sources we talked about, the court transcripts, the interviews, the expert opinions, read them, really think about them, and then, ask yourself, what do you think happened to Felicia Tang?
What makes sense to you? What evidence stands out? This isn't about finding one single truth. It's about asking questions, wrestling with the fact that sometimes there aren't easy answers, and ultimately coming to your own conclusion based on what you've learned.
And that's what I hope you take away from this deep dive. The Preacher and the Porn Star, it's not just a sensational story. It's a reminder that justice, well, it's rarely black and white. It's messy. It's full of gray areas. And it leaves us with questions that might never be fully answered. But it's a process that deserves our attention. It requires us to think critically and to, be willing to face those uncomfortable truths.